Okay, welcome everyone to the Air-Sea Fluxes from Space webinar series. Today, Claudia Pasquero from the University of Milan is going to talk about ocean forcing of atmospheric boundary layer properties and effects on surface heat flux variability. And I think this is a contribution related to the Harmony mission. So take it away, Claudia.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting me and thank you for being here. So when we talk about ocean forcing of the atmosphere, I think we all have this. Yeah, okay. So I thought it was working, but it's not. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, we're all thinking about this kind of figures that are taken from Gentleman et al. 2020 that look at the correlation coefficient between wind speed and sea surface temperature at a daily time scale. And if we look at the full correlation, this is clearly negative, indicating that the atmosphere is forcing the ocean in the sense that stronger winds mix the upper ocean and generate a cooling at the surface. But when we high-pass filter those data, the picture changes completely and it turns to the one underneath, to the one below. Yeah, you can see my pointer, where the correlation coefficient is essentially positive, and we interpret this as the ocean that's forcing the atmosphere in the sense that warm SST structures favor essentially the vertical redistribution of properties in the atmosphere, and this brings down momentum from the free troposphere to the surface, generating an increase in wind speed. Actually, we can see that the correlation coefficient is highly variable. It's overall, let's say, positive, but it's highly variable. And clearly, this is related to the typical conditions that we have in the different regions of the world. By looking at the environmental conditions, one can look at what are the conditions that lead to the largest coupling coefficient. The coupling coefficient is simply the derivative du dSST, so the derivative of wind speed versus sea surface temperature. And in this plot, in the upper left plot, there is the background air sea temperature difference, which for negative values indicates unstable conditions in the atmosphere. And for positive values, it refers to stable conditions in the atmosphere. On the y-axis, we have the background wind speed. And one can see that the largest coupling coefficients are found clearly next to near stability, next to zero. So those are weakly unstable air columns. And it makes a lot of sense, of course, in the sense that for very stable or very unstable conditions, changing a little bit the sea surface temperature doesn't affect much the stability properties of the atmosphere, and so there is no much effect. So the largest effects are near neutral stability, and where the lower panel shows where those conditions are typically met. So there is, again, geographical redistribution. We know that the atmospheric response to the same SST gradient will differ depending on the environmental conditions. So clearly we cannot talk about being global anymore. We have to go, if we want to go deeper into this, we need to focus on specific regions. And the one that I'm going to focus now is the, let me skip this, is the Eureka region, just because we have, it's a region where Eureka atomic region, just because it's a region where we have lots of data that have been recently acquired, and so we refer to these data as well. So let's go to that specific region, which is not a region where we have lots of sea surface temperature gradients. Clearly, there are regions that have much stronger sea surface temperature structures. But what we're going to do is actually to play. So let me go back a little bit. We said that the coupling coefficient changes from being negative at the large scale to becoming positive at the smaller scale. And one might wonder what is the scale where, at what scales the ocean is really forcing the atmosphere. Is there a lower scale at which the ocean stops forcing the ocean, in the sense that the atmosphere, that the air passing above a structure in the ocean doesn't really have the time to respond to that sea surface temperature structure? And so we are interested in seeing the variability of the coupling coefficient by changing the scale of the high pass filter. And that's what has been done here in this Eureka atomic region, starting from Flux data and from ERA 5 data. So we're talking about a larger scale, mesoscale and larger scale, not really the finest scale that we can observe, of course. This is the scale of the cutoff for the high-pass filter, and this is the coupling coefficient, and we're going to see how that varies. And just as a reference, well, the unfiltered distribution would be somewhere down here. And then clearly this coupling coefficient from negative turns into positive in the mesoscale kind of range for C-surface temperature structures. And then it peaks and then it starts decreasing again. So the peak is on the order, is at a scale of the order of a few hundred kilometers, which is typically the mesoscale. However, I would not dare to conclude from this result that at smaller scale, the coupling between the atmosphere and the ocean and the atmosphere becomes less strong. I wouldn't dare to do that simply because we are close to hitting actually the scale at which those data sets can be used. Both ERA 5 and Flux are on a 25 by 25 kilometers grid, and so that means that the lowest wavelength that can be resolved is on the order of 100 kilometers. So you see that we are clearly very, very close to the limit, to the lower limits that can be represented in those data sets. And so ERA 5 for the way things are computed, Flux has clearly lots of interpolation to fill the gaps, and so that smooths the fields. So I wouldn't conclude that that this is really the scale at which the coupling is strongest. In order to investigate a little bit more this kind of relationship, we looked into the single swaths, individual swaths, where there is less smoothing, less interpolation. There is no interpolation. And so we can look at the relationship between ASCAT winds and SST, and we always see that the figure that I put here is for it's actually the relationship, the slope of this curve is the coupling coefficient for the Eureka region, and the coupling coefficients that we get in this way are always larger than the ones that are obtained in ERA 5. This has been done systematically through many different regions of the world, not only in the Eureka region, but also in Gulf Stream regions or in Western Boundary Currents regions in the Southern Ocean and such. And we see that the air-sea coupling taken from individual swaths is always larger. So there is structure that is not fully captured by the gridded data sets. And so we would need to go to finer scale in order to keep investigating the atmospheric, the lower atmospheric response to sea surface temperatures. So let's leave these on a side. And actually, we are doing this on SAR data that clearly have much finer resolution in the winds. The problem are the winds, clearly not the SST. We have plenty of high resolution SST data. But for now, I stop here for the link with the wind because we are not able to go to finer scale yet. But, thinking about fluxes, however, we know, and quite a few studies recently show that over sea surface temperature fronts, the fluxes depend a lot on air properties, such as, for instance, the water vapor mixing ratio, so the humidity, the moisture content of the atmosphere. So we can play a similar game, a similar exercise, and not really a game, looking at the correlation and the coupling coefficient between sea surface temperature and the specific humidity. Actually, if we do, if we simply look at the raw data at the large scale, clearly we know that there is a positive correlation between sea surface temperature and moisture. Clearly, large scale warm SST, warm ocean leads to larger moisture content in the atmosphere. No surprises in that sense. So at the large scale, the ocean forces the atmospheric moisture content. And we can play the same role, the same exercise as I said before, by changing the filtering scale. and looking at how the coupling coefficient varies, going to finer and finer scale. And I think everyone would expect that the coupling coefficient eventually goes towards zero, in the sense that if we go to finer and finer scales, as I said before, the air blowing over a structure, a sea surface temperature structure, doesn't really have the time to respond. And so at some point, the moisture at the fine scale would be uncorrelated with sea surface temperature. And so the coupling coefficient would go around zero. But actually, we see that while for era 5, we only see this decreasing trend going to finer scale, interestingly, the sea flux data show a negative value, a slightly negative value. And rather than thinking that this might, I mean, we do have reasons for believing that this might actually be a significant signal, and let me explain why and why it is important. So we go to the in situ observations from Eureka, and from radio sounding data, we now are looking at a relatively small scale. I mean, the ship here were moving, the ships were moving across the front that has slightly more than 1 degree Celsius in temperature change, and the whole box is less than 100 kilometers by 100 kilometers here. So, and many, I think about 50 radio soundings were taken in the matter of a few days here. And those radio soundings would profile actually the atmosphere, and systematically indicated that over warmer SST, that are those profiles in red, the water vapor was lower than over colder SST, which is exactly what we were seeing before in the sea flux data set. So less water vapor, specific humidity, is reduced over warmer waters. So rather than not being present any atmospheric response to SST, we actually see an opposite response to what we could expect in principle, or at least what I would have naively expected. The boundary layer, the atmosphere is responding because there are other signals that appear, such as, for instance, there is a different cloud distribution. We will get back to that later on. The boundary layer thickness changes, the lifting condensation level changes from warm SST to cold SST. Or in those plots, in these couple of plots, there are SSTs on the x-axis, and this is cloud fraction that changes with SST. Those are, as I said, boundary layer height and lifting condensation levels as a function of SST. And so there is a signal, although noisy, of course, but there is a signal. And clearly there is also a big change in latent heat flux, and the similar results has also been obtained by the atomic group of people, indicating very large latent heat flux variability in this region. So larger latent heat flux over warm than over cold patches. By the way, those are not individual soundings, so those are averages over bins of SST, so conditioned to the SST. So cold SST have more water vapor in terms of specific humidity than warm SST. And in order to make sense of those observations, we decided to run some numerical simulations with WRF. Those are atmospheric uncoupled at this stage, forced by Muir SST, so high resolution observation of sea surface temperature. And WRF simulations are run on nested domains. The inner domain, that's the one that I'm going to show you results from, has a grid of 3 by 3 kilometers, forced with ERA 5 lateral boundary conditions. And then what we can do here in the model is to high-pass filter all the fields in order to focus only on the small-scale features. And I'm showing you a couple of figures here that summarize the results. So if this is a sea surface temperature anomaly, cold patches, warm patches on this side, this is pressure above the sea. So we're moving upward here, and the black line is the boundary layer height from the simulation. So we see that there is a response, as in the observation of boundary layer height, that increases by a couple of 100 meters over warmer patches than over colder patches. And the wind, as expected, is actually weaker on the cold side and warmer and stronger on the warm side. No surprises here. I also decided to highlight the Brunt-Väisälä frequency change, so indicating the stability of the air column. And we see that indeed at the top of the boundary layer on the warm side, the Brunt-Väisälä frequency has a negative anomaly, meaning that the atmosphere here is less stable, and it's more stable on the other side. So clearly this is what favors entrainment from above. And so a cartoon that describes what's going on is the one that I put here. Sorry, it's a little bit too gray and not enough dark. But this is a cartoon showing height and different profiles of wind, which is clearly larger in the free troposphere than in the boundary layer. Potential temperature, again, here we have an inversion layer, so warmer air above that stabilizes the atmosphere, and so the boundary layer doesn't entrain typically too much free tropospheric air. And specific humidity is what is very important, because specific humidity is actually larger in the boundary layer, clearly in contact with the sea, and it's actually relatively dry. It's actually very dry above. And so whenever we increase the entrainment on warm patches, we are actually entraining lots of dry air into the boundary layer. And that is the process that is responsible for this negative correlation at small scales between sea surface temperature and specific humidity in the boundary layer. So having understood this, we can clearly look at the fluxes and how the fluxes respond, and interpret the different role played by the different type of responses to SST. So what is shown here is actually the latent heat flux anomalies versus the SST anomalies from the model. And we see that the typical sensitivity, the mean sensitivity from the model is on the order of, let's say, 50 watts per meter square per degree Celsius, which is in the same ballpark of the observations, so what the observations tell us. And now we can actually partition between all the different, the role played by the different response, the different terms responding to SST variations. And so if we take a bulk formula for the latent heat flux, that has the important parts here relevant are the dependence on wind speed, the dependence on the SST, the saturation specific humidity at temperature equal to the sea surface temperature, and let's say the relative humidity or the specific humidity, depending on what formulation we want to use. We actually can see that the direct response to the specific humidity at saturation for the temperature equal corresponding to the sea surface temperature is simply given by the Clausius-Clapeyron relationship. And that turns out to be relatively small, 5 watts per meter square per degree Celsius. So that's what we would have, the sensitivity that we would have, assuming that relative humidity doesn't change, wind doesn't change. The only thing that changes is actually SST affecting Q star SST, Q saturation of SST. So it's a very small, relatively small change, and that's the kind of change that we would expect at large scale, assuming that the atmosphere has time to adjust and so to equilibrate, let's say, with the ocean underneath. Going to smaller scales, clearly we could actually ask the question of what would be the sensitivity, assuming that U doesn't change and Q doesn't change. So assuming that there is no response. And so if we are going from a warm patch actually, if we're going from a cold patch to a warm patch, the air moisture doesn't change, and so there is an increase, a very strong, much stronger increase of latent heat flux than in the pure Clausius-Clapeyron relationship. So that's what we would expect in the case in which the coupling coefficient between Q and SST was going to 0. And it turns out that this is on the order of 25, 30 watts per meter square per degree Celsius, which is still, let's say, half of what we get, on the order of half of what we get. So what is really important is the change in Q, is the change in specific humidity in air. That's the driver. This is the same conclusion that Ye et al. In the recent paper from the Atomic Campaign describe. So they say what is important among all the things that vary across the front is really Q. And in this region, at least the numerical simulations show that the change in Q is not unrelated to the SST, but it's still a response to the SST in terms of this enhanced entrainment. I mentioned before that there are also effects on clouds. Indeed, the changes in clouds, both in the observations and in the numerical simulations, show more clouds, higher clouds, and thicker clouds over the warm patch, exactly because there is there are very much larger fluxes of moisture, and so the air becomes more moist. And so thinking about the observations, it means that we might also be able to extract information on this coupling, looking at the variability of clouds. And that's what we are doing right now by analyzing simultaneously clouds, wind, and SST to help constrain the latent heat flux sensitivity to the fine scale processes at the RC interface. In the Eureka region, we think we have understood what the dynamical process that links them is. In other regions, clearly there would be different processes. So for instance, in the Gulf Stream region, I'm thinking about the recent work by Strobach et al. That point out that the secondary circulation that develops on top of a SST front that actually brings down dry air that increases a lot the latent heat flux. So there might be different processes if we would like to understand what they are. And the only, the way this is related to harmony is in the sense that harmony would provide finer scale observations of clouds and winds. SST only when there are no clouds, so not a lot of luck there, but hopefully we will be able to extend this kind of studies going to finer and finer scale and see and better constrain the latent heat flux sensitivity to the ocean forcing. So I'll stop here and thank you for listening.
Well, thank you, Claudia. This was great. Questions? And maybe while people are thinking of questions, I'll ask about, you mentioned wind, but I'll ask whether the humidity effect you saw varies with wind speed, and if you if you have enough data to separate that out, to look at a wind speed dependence.
The wind speed, no, okay, not in the data.
Mm-hmm.
At the small scale, you mean? So in the region. No, we haven't been able to do that actually. So you are suggesting to look at whether there is an wind speed change by a few meters per second. So there is a substantial, a reasonable change of wind speed. I mean, it's and the moisture is actually, the moisture signal from the observations was already tricky to extract, also because over the time over which the data were collected, there was a general drying. And so the whole area dried a little bit. 1 gram per kilogram, maybe a bit less than that. And so clearly it was necessary to separate, to remove this drying effect. But that means that trying to extract more dependencies, we might give it another try, but we haven't been able to do that.
Maybe with the model then. Yeah, I asked because you suggested that some of this had to do with how quickly different air advects over the region.
Oh yeah, yeah. We actually came up with a scaling argument for the time scale. Essentially, yes, we did that in numerical simulations over different regions, and not in this region. I didn't talk about other regions that we investigated, and yes, we did come up with a sort of it's not really a spatial scale, it's a length scale, because it depends on the wind speed. So you're totally correct in the sense that higher wind speeds means that the air is moving faster over a patch, and so it would have less time to react. So in the end, it is dependent on wind speed. Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, that would be fun to tease apart, but challenging.
We haven't done that in this region, but we did try to do it in other simulations in the Mediterranean. Yes.
Other questions for Claudia? Well, I'll ask another question. Then you mentioned the analysis you've shown here is really targeting one region, and you speculated a little about other areas. How much do you think this would change if you, say, went to the Southern Ocean or other parts of the Nino 3.4 region, or somewhere that's really distinctly different?
As I said, different processes would be triggered, because I think this is really related to the inversion layer and the stability properties that we have there and such. So clearly different processes would occur in different parts of the world. And so, for instance, we noticed that very large, of course, very large fluxes are found over when there is a cold air outbreak. So we're talking about mid to high latitudes now, and a warm ocean with cold air coming from the continents. There are huge fluxes, and those huge fluxes are able to actually trigger secondary circulation in the atmosphere, meaning that the air column expands and there is a pressure adjustment that generates secondary circulation. So it becomes a process that's entirely different from this one. We haven't looked into the Southern Ocean yet. That's not a region that we focused yet. We looked at however, in the Southern Ocean, for the relationship between wind and SST, but not moisture and not fluxes, only wind. And the Southern Ocean is actually different in the sense that the coupling, different from the Northern Hemisphere, in the sense that the coupling coefficient is strongly seasonally varying, because there is a stronger seasonal cycle in the Northern Hemisphere, and in the Southern Hemisphere, it's the seasonal cycle is actually more limited because of the larger portion of the globe covered by ocean. And so also the coupling coefficients between wind and SST have less seasonal variability. So those are the things that come to mind when thinking about Southern Ocean. We haven't investigated yet possible responses in moisture in that region.
Yeah, and that's a pretty dry region too. So
large fluxes, absolutely. Strong wind, dry regions. Yeah, but I think one really needs to go region by region, because the processes might be quite different. And if we want to understand the processes, then we have to deal with the actual dynamics in that region. Yeah.
Yeah. So Rick Danielson has his hand up. Rick, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, hi, Claudia. It's provocative. The results you're showing are and especially in the context of harmony. So I guess my question relates to last week's discussion and the possibility that it's maybe not just entrainment with the dry air above the boundary layer, but the full atmospheric, boundary layer circulation. Is there sort of a convective signal that one could see in harmony data that would suggest, a full boundary layer entrainment process rather than just, I mean, there is obviously that going on in all cases, but a difference in the dynamics of the boundary layer in these different SST conditions or stability conditions. So relating to last week's talk, I guess.
Yeah. So you're saying clearly, if you change let's say the turbulent parametrization, the turbulent transport, not really just the parametrization in the boundary layer, you might have a different effects on latent heat flux. And so you're wondering whether this is, it's really a signal related to entrainment or not. Well, in the model that we run, clearly that's the case, also because we don't have boundary layer rolls, we don't have other types of, we are not running a LES, we don't have those structures. So it's clearly not related to a change in the turbulence in the boundary layer, because we are not able in our model to differentiate it in a significant way. You're wondering whether it's only entrainment or in any case, the data are showing that the whole boundary layer has a specific humidity that is lower over warm SST, and the boundary layer height increases. So the fact the boundary layer height increases means that the boundary layer expands, entrains more air. That's the only explanation.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
I wouldn't, I think there is a strong signature, and the data really show that the boundary layer height changes. So it has to be a change in the entrainment. And actually with Eureka, considering the fact that there are those camera in the visible, they are able to see the cloud top and also a little bit the cloud top evolution, because they see the motion for a few minutes. They track the motion of the low clouds top. The hope, but we haven't really worked on that yet, is to be able to relate these cloud top motion to the fluxes at the sea surface and to the sea surface temperature anomalies. So hopefully we will be able to get some insights, because we see not only the boundary layer, the cloud top, but also how they are evolving for a few minutes. So
Thanks.
maybe we have some signature of the entrainment, the change in entrainment, let's say.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions? Well, if I can ask one more question. Oh, I'll let Roger go first. Roger Samuelson has his hand up.
Yeah, along those same lines, where were these cases in terms of stability? The plot that you showed at the beginning of near neutrality, and also in the model, which do you know which boundary layer schemes you're using in that model? Just out of curiosity.
I need to check. I said I'm gonna pull it out and I'm gonna re-see it. I'm gonna verify which one it is, and now I don't. And then I forgot. But let me let me answer to that in a little bit. But about the stability.
I guess, sorry, just while we're on this slide still, part of this question is the clouds on the right, they seem to be associated with a certain temperature, not a certain temperature difference across a gradient or something.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And so,
No.
I don't fully understand the whole situation.
No, that's I didn't explain that actually, but the data collected along the ship, where the ship was moving, went on a range of SST that varies by a degree or so, and it's all small scale. So in the model, we actually filter the data and we describe the high pass filtered anomalies. But in the observations, we don't have any large scale. It's all small scale. And of course, one could define a mean and define some anomalies, but it would be exactly the same thing. So we are not exploring a wide region where SST varies, I mean, where we can have the same SST in very different dynamical regimes, because we are in a narrow, really narrow region. And so looking at high resolution sea surface temperature anomalies or sea surface temperature per se doesn't make much difference. Then you also asked where are in the stability. In the diagram for the stability. So here we are in a relatively strong wind, moderate winds, I mean, those are trade winds, so they are relatively strong. The coupling coefficient becomes very small if we are on very low wind speed, because there is not much response, of course, if there are very weak winds. Also, the tropospheric winds are slow, but actually we are not in that regime. And we are not particularly next to neutral stability. So this is not one of the regions where we can expect the largest sensitivity. Still, there is a response, even if we are not very close to neutral stability. And for the question about the scheme that was used in these simulations, it is just checking that. And well, it will take me a little while to check that, sorry. Maybe it's better.
Okay, it's not so important, but there can be a dependence.
Oh, yeah.
Schemes.
No, but I agree with you that the exact results that we get are strongly dependent on the boundary layer parameterizations. And I'm not saying that the one that we are using is the correct one, by no means. Right. But I think so I wouldn't rely too much on the specific numbers, but I think the processes can be understood. Then the specific numbers are clearly depending on the parameterizations that are used. So no doubt about that.
Just can I ask one more question about the stability? You said you're not close to neutral stability. Does that mean that you're on the convective side?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, I see. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's helpful and maybe important in this.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry for not. I gave it for granted, but sorry. Yes, thanks for specifying that. And actually, this is a region where at the top of the boundary layer, there are stratus clouds that also develop shallow convection at the top of the boundary layer. So the cloud distribution is made of those top of the boundary layer clouds that elevate when, especially during night, late early morning. They generate a little bit thicker clouds that eventually can drizzle a little bit. This is the standard situation that we have in the trade wind regions. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that's all very helpful.
Thank you.
Other questions? Maybe I'll go back and ask the question I was going to ask, which is, you mentioned that Harmony is good for parts of what you want to do, but it doesn't give an SST under clouds. I had thought that there was an ESA project in development for microwave SST with a very large antenna that would provide high resolution SST simmer. Would that make a difference? Would that be coincident enough to help with Harmony?
So clearly we do have plenty of data of SST under clouds and such. So we are planning to match, I mean, not use Harmony per se, but in conjunction with permissions with other. We haven't looked yet at the observational masks enough to be able to answer precisely to that question. But I don't think the SST is the big problem, and especially in regions where I mean, we will have some observations of SST. I mean, if the scene is not completely covered with SST, we will see a little bit of SST, and so hopefully. We haven't tried yet, but hopefully we will be able to solve that issue. So far in the data, in the analysis that we made, we were constrained much more by winds than by SST information, simply because there are finer resolution SST observations available, and it's relatively well distributed over the globe. Yeah. Okay, yes, YSU PBL scheme. Yonsei University. Sorry, now I found it. I knew that, but I couldn't remember it. Okay, yes.
Okay, thanks.
And Tony has clarified that Simmer will be able to get SST at 10 to 15 kilometer resolution.
Yeah.
Nicholas Schneider has his hand up.
Yeah, let me try to get online here. I just wonder, you mentioned a little bit the response of the diurnal cycle with a drizzle. Is there any coupling between the response to the small scale SSTs, the annual cycle, that in the cycle is slightly enhanced or weakened, or affected by the small scales?
Yeah, very interesting question. Thank you, Nicholas. We are actually, it's exactly what we want to do right now, because we haven't done it yet. The simulations that I described is done with, first of all, it's uncoupled, and then it's done with forced by daily SST. So we don't have the seasonal cycle in the SST. We only have the seasonal cycle in the winds, which is, by the way, the largest component of the, sorry, I said seasonal, I meant daily. The daily cycle, of course, is coming from the winds. The winds are changing significantly from night to day. They are strongest at night, and they are less strong, they are weaker during the daylight. And this is present in the model because the domain is relatively small, and so the boundary condition provide the daily cycle in the wind speed. But we don't have any SST daily cycle. So we are now starting to analyze the couple experiment in order to answer exactly these kind of questions. But
Great,
at this point, I cannot answer to it.
Good, thanks.
Thank you.
Well, any further questions? If not, this has been a really great discussion. Thank you, Claudia, and thanks to everyone for participating.
Thank you.
The recording.
Thank you very much.